Hi, I'm Dan Obishan. Welcome back to the Joy of Teaching Tennis. One thing I forgot to mention in last week's video was the French Open has started. And actually, the morning that we filmed the video on listening was the morning of the historic match that Rafa Nadal lost in the first round to Zverev. And so it might be the last time that Rafa competes in the French Open, which for a long time people said that the hardest thing to do in all of sports was to beat Rafa Nadal on the red clay courts of Roland Garros. So I hope you're all watching the French Open and enjoying it. Last week's hat, I hope everybody could see it. That's why we did a little different start. But last week's hat was a hat that I purchased in Portland, Maine at a concert that Greg Allman and his band performed. I was a huge fan of the Allman Brothers Band from the time I was in high school and college. And actually in the 70s, I saw the Allman Brothers perform 4 times in 1 month. But that Greg Allman, and actually the day that we filmed that video on listening was the anniversary of Greg Allman's passing away. So it was a dual purpose in my wearing that hat. And Paul, I hope you got the answer before anybody else. So today we're into the second letter of our listen, observe, teach, the LOT theory. Last week we talked about listening. This week we're talking about observe. We talked about how the purpose of listening is to understand your students' beliefs, their knowledge about their own game, their desires of what they want to do and improve. So that's the purpose of listening. Once you have all that information, you need to test it. Why do we need to test it? Why do we need to observe? Because the students don't know the answer. Listening gives us what's going on in the student's head. Observing gives us what's going on with the student's body, with their game. You're the teacher, you're the expert, you're the one who has to evaluate what they're doing. And you need to see if there's a disconnect between their understanding and what their body's doing, because that will help you more than almost anything else in knowing what to teach. If the student believes that the problem with their forehand is that they're not following through, and you watch and their follow through is perfect, but the problem is their preparation on the forehand, well, then you've got to figure out how you're going to approach that disconnect and give them the knowledge of what they're actually doing so that they can improve. This is where teaching becomes an art form. That's why I love the listen, observe, teach theory, because LOT allows you to understand the scenario that's being painted, to understand what's going on in your student's head and with their body. So how do you observe them? Well, it depends on the level of player, the type of stroke that they're doing. There's a lot of different ways. You can feed the ball, you can toss the ball, you can rally with students. In group lessons, I always felt that the most valuable time was putting the students on the court to warm up and rally with each other. That was where I would get the most critical information. If you're dealing with a competitive player, you want to watch them compete. You want to watch them play and actually see what they do under competitive pressure. So it really depends on the answer. Many years ago when I was running PBI training programs, and one of the projects that the pros in training had to do was to write a newsletter. And they did a Dear Abby type column called Ask Dan. And they wrote these really great, interesting, complex, multifaceted questions And my answer was always, it depends. And that's because they heard that an awful lot during training. But that's the essence of the idea of teaching individuals instead of a system. It really does depend on the student. My preferred method of observing the student was if they were a good enough level that they could hit the ball, I like to feed the ball and rally with them with me at the net volleying. Wasn't a perfect system because the ball being volleyed to them was not like a ground stroke ball. But I liked it because, number one, I volleyed a lot better than I hit ground strokes, so I could focus on the student. Number two, I was closer and I didn't have the distance and the impediment of the net, so I could really see the student better. And number three, they'd get a lot more hits per second with the volleys, with the shorter rallies of a hit and back and forth. If the student didn't have the skill level to rally with my ball, I would feed it to them. If they didn't have the skill level, if they were intimidated by a fed ball, I could toss it to them. I know a lot of coaches will start off rallying with their student or playing mini tennis with their student. There's no wrong answer to what you do to observe. Just make sure that you phrase it as a warm-up. Don't say to the student, I'm going to observe you, Reese, and watch them right there, because you're putting pressure on them. Just say, let's warm up. But you know that the real purpose of the warm-up is to observe the student. There's also no set time limit. As my skill grew as a coach, I really became more and more comfortable with the idea of observing longer before I started teaching. When you're a brand new teacher, you kind of think that you're being paid by the word. So you want to start talking the minute the student gets on the court and finish talking, on the last second, and then you rush to pick up the balls before the next lesson. That's really bad use of your time. Your time is more valuable to you and the student if you spend time asking questions and listening to the answer, and if you spend time observing the student and really formulate the plan in your head for the best way to help that student by observing. Many times I would see young pros in their practice teaching lessons in PBI training where, because we emphasize it so much, they would ask the questions. But then as soon as the student said something like, I don't take the racket back early enough on my forehand, boom, immediately the coach would start teaching them how to take their racket back on the forehand. Where 9 times out of 10, that wasn't the problem. If students knew what their problem was, they wouldn't need you. They would solve it on their own. So really, I can count on 2 hands and 50 years of teaching when the student really told me what was wrong with their game, and they were right. They knew what was wrong with their game. So that observe stage is really critical. And as I said, there's no time limit. I've spent as long as 30, almost 40 minutes in a 1-hour lesson because I was confused. I couldn't understand what the problem was. Some of the information that the student gave me that I listened to was so disconnected from what they were doing physically that I didn't formulate the plan right away to go to what happened. And the student was fine with that long observation because they were being active, they were hitting balls. They didn't realize that I was the one that was confused. And other times, right away, the first rally, you see it, you see what the problem is, you've already listened and heard what the student said. So observe is a very critical step in the listen, observe, teach. And last week I said the listening was the skill that needed the most improvement by a teacher. This week, I think observe is the stage that is most often skipped. Remember, tell the student you're warming up, take your time, observe, figure it out what's the best thing you can do for your student. So that's listen, observe, and next week we will go to teach. Thanks a lot for viewing. Go out there and joyfully observe those students.